Okay, so picture this. Your system, it's totally overloaded,
Mm-hmm.
deadlines. Yeah,
Mm.
there's like breathing down your neck.
Ooh.
And then someone throws out those two magic words, like
Yep.
microservices, and
Yeah.
suddenly it's like, like everything's going to be fine, all our scaling problems solved, but
Only were that simple.
right, exactly. So are they really the answer? Well, that's what we're diving into today, event-driven microservice architecture.
Okay.
And, we're not messing around with, like, theoretical textbooks here.
Yeah.
We went straight to the source Reddit, our software architecture, to be exact.
Always a lively place.
Oh, tell me about it. But before you bounce thinking, oh, great, another Reddit thread breakdown, this isn't just, like, random ranting. We're talking experienced developers, people who've actually been there, done that. And they're getting real about, well, everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, you name it.
The good, the bad, and the complex, that's what we're after today. Whether you're just dipping your toes into the microservices pool or you're already swimming in the deep end.
Yeah, exactly.
We're here to equip you with the kind of insights you need to navigate this landscape.
Think of it like distilling the collective wisdom of the internet, into something you can actually use.
Because knowledge without application,
No.
what good is it?
Exactly.
Right.
So let's start with the appeal. Why are developers so drawn to event-driven microservices?
Well, scalability is a big one, right? I mean, it pops up all over that thread.
Makes sense.
It's like, imagine your system's this bustling city, yeah. And instead of everything being crammed into one giant building, your monolith microservices are like, they let you break that city down into these smaller interconnected districts, each one handling its own thing.
Okay, so each with its own, like, specific function.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
this way you can handle growth much easier. You're directing traffic where it needs to go without, like, overloading the entire system.
So instead of one massive traffic jam,
You got it.
you have more,
Manageable flow.
yeah, exactly.
And it's not just about handling those traffic spikes. It also brings flexibility to the table.
Oh, how so?
So say you need to renovate one of those districts, update a service. With event-driven microservices, you can theoretically do that without, like, shutting down the entire city.
That's huge.
Right. One user, Casas and Garcia, I think, he put it really well. He was talking about how even if one service goes down, the others can keep chugging along.
No more single points of failure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No more, if one thing breaks, everything breaks.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing, in theory.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Well, software development is rarely as straightforward as we'd like it to be, right?
That's the truth.
Yeah, it can get messy.
So what kind of messy are we talking about? What are the speed bumps on this road to microservice bliss?
Well, complexity is a big one. Definitely not a smooth ride. It's easy to get caught up in how elegant it all looks, microservices on a whiteboard.
Right, yeah.
But in reality, it can turn into a tangled mess pretty quickly. At least that's what one user, iSurfer10, pointed out.
And it's not just about, like, lines of code, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It's the whole system, really.
How do these services even talk to each other? How do they find each other?
Exactly. And then what happens when something goes wrong? How do you make sure it fails gracefully? It's a lot to manage.
I bet.
And then there's the human side of things. You need teams who are ready for this kind of architectural shift. They have to be comfortable with asynchronous programming and really embrace this whole new way of thinking about building software.
Yeah, it's a whole different ballgame.
Right. And Cratermoon, another Redditor, brought up a really good point about how some developers who are used to that request response world, they might resist this change.
It's understandable, though, really.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it is a whole different beast. And we can't forget about the operations folks either.
Yeah, they're crucial.
Absolutely. Cratermoon also mentioned that supporting a message broker, which is kind of like the postal service in our city analogy, it requires a totally different skill set. It's not like managing traditional servers.
So you can't just kind of, like, throw this new architecture at them and be like, good luck, guys.
Exactly. Teamwork is key here.
Speaking of things that can be tricky, let's talk about debugging for a sec.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
One user, I think it was Professor Jeff, he had this really great analogy. He was saying it's like, each service works perfectly fine on its own, but when you bring them all together and something goes wrong, it's like trying to find a faulty wire in a massive electrical grid.
Oof. Yeah. Good luck with that.
Where do you even begin?
Right. It's a debugging nightmare. And that actually leads us to another major hurdle, data management. Specifically, keeping things consistent across our microservice city.
Okay, yeah, because in a monolith, you've usually got that one source of truth.
Your central database, exactly. But with microservices, each service could have its own data store, its own version of events even.
So how do you make sure they're all on the same page?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question. And it's where things get really, really interesting from a technical perspective. We're talking about concepts like idempotency, which is basically making sure your services don't break if an event gets delivered twice, you know.
Okay.
And then there's handling events that arrive out of order, dealing with duplicate messages, and of course making sure that data is consistent across all these different distributed services.
Sounds like a recipe for like a massive headache if you're not careful.
You could say that again? And don't even get me started on schema evolution.
All right.
In a monolith, you update your database schema in one place. Pretty straightforward. But when you have multiple services, each with its own schema potentially, managing those changes is a whole other level of difficult.
Yeah, I can see why some of those Redditors were waving those red flags now.
Oh, for sure. And those red flags are important to pay attention to. One user even mentioned having to tell another team,
Yeah.
like, look, this architecture, it might look great on paper, but in reality, there's no guarantee that messages will only get delivered once. Yeah, and that means your service could end up totally corrupted.
Oof. That's a tough conversation to have.
Yeah.
So, with all of these potential problems, is there ever a time when event-driven microservices are actually the right choice? Or are we like destined to just stick with our, maybe clunky but familiar monoliths?
It's like we're talking about two totally different worlds. Like on the one hand, you have this perfect vision of like totally independent services all humming along.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there's the reality of actually building and maintaining these systems. And it sounds, well, kind of messy. Yeah. And like most things in software, the truth usually lies somewhere in between those two extremes.
Okay, so then how do we know if we're ready to, to dive into the microservices pool? What should we be thinking about besides just like the technical stuff?
Well, one thing that came up a lot in that Reddit thread was, the expertise of your team.
Right, having the right people for the job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One user, I think it was Flinta Raskar, said something like, hiring good devs, it's a non-scalable problem. And it's true. You can throw all the fancy tech you want at a problem.
Right.
But if your team isn't comfortable with the kind of the core concepts here, distributed systems, asynchronous programming, event-driven architecture, you're going to have a really, really tough time.
It's like trying to build a rocket ship when all you've ever built is like toy cars.
Exactly. And even with a skilled team, you still need those clear boundaries between your services.
Oh, right. You mentioned that earlier. Bounded contexts.
Yeah, exactly. That came up a lot in the thread, too.
Yeah.
Basically, each service needs to have its own clearly defined responsibility. Like, think back to those city districts we were talking about.
Okay, yeah.
If the boundaries are blurry, you end up with what some people call a distributed monolith.
Oh, I've heard that term. So you're saying it's not just about chopping up a monolith into smaller pieces.
Nope, not at all. It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
You really have to understand the domain you're working in, how the different parts of the system interact.
Like city planning.
Exactly. You wouldn't just draw lines on a map randomly. You'd think about, traffic flow, population density, all of that. And that actually leads us to another important point. Knowing when not to use event-driven microservices.
Oh, yeah. Because it's not always the answer, is it?
Right. One Redditor told this story about seeing companies just like blindly jump on the microservices bandwagon. They were replacing simple method calls with these like complex webs of APIs. And it just turned into this huge nightmare for deployment and debugging.
Oof, yeah. You can get seduced by the hype pretty easily in this industry.
Totally. And that's why it's so important to like take a step back, really understand the problem you're actually trying to solve, and explore those simpler solutions first.
So before you like go all in on microservices.
Exactly. Ask yourself, can I optimize my database?
Yeah.
Can I introduce caching? Can I refactor my monolith into like well-defined modules? Sometimes the simplest solution really is the best one.
So much to think about.
Right. But if you do decide to go the microservice route, just, go it with your eyes wide open. Be aware of the complexities, the trade-offs.
Yeah.
Because there are always trade-offs, right?
I was just going to say that. There's no such thing as a free lunch in software development.
Exactly. Like one trade-off that comes up all the time is performance versus consistency.
Yeah.
In a distributed system, making sure that all your services have the exact same view of the data at all times.
Yeah.
That can be incredibly difficult to achieve. And it often comes at the cost of Well, performance.
It's like choosing between like a race car and a
A truck.
yeah, a truck. The race car's fast, but it might not always be reliable.
Exactly. And then there's the balance between, how quickly you can develop new features versus how complex it is to keep everything running smoothly in production.
Right, development speed versus operational complexity.
Yeah, and in theory, microservices can speed up development,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because teams can work on different services independently.
Right.
But as we've been talking about, this often means that the operational side of things gets way more complex.
Yeah, you need those specialized skills and tools to manage it all. So it's not a simple decision.
It really isn't. And that actually brings us to the final thought we want to leave you with today.
Okay, lay it on us. What's the big takeaway here?
We've talked about the potential benefits of event-driven microservices. We've dug into the very real challenges, and we've touched on some of the things you really need to think about before taking the plunge.
It's been a lot to process.
It has. But at the end of the day, the most important question to ask yourself is, what are my non-negotiables? What trade-offs am I willing to make? And what am I absolutely not willing to compromise on?
Oh, I like that. So it's about knowing your own values and priorities.
Exactly. And then making sure that your architectural decisions, they align with those values.
Because the right approach is the one that works for your team, your organization, and the problem you're trying to solve.
Well said.
Yeah.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Eye-opening for sure.
Maybe even a little daunting at times. But it's clear that, event-driven microservices, they're a powerful tool.
They are.
But like any powerful tool, they need to be used with care, consideration, and a healthy dose of, well, realism.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And hey, the conversation doesn't end here, right? We want to hear from you. What are your experiences with microservices? What are your thoughts, your war stories? Connect with us on social media. Share your insights.
And until next time, happy coding, everyone.